Good afternoon, everybody. Before we get started with today's webinar, I just want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today and recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place by storytelling and through the sharing of experiences. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Well, thanks everybody. My name is Anthony Caruana, and on behalf of CIM, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, where our expert panel is going to help you prepare for forthcoming requirements for government leases. As part of today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A function on your webinar screen. So please, as you hear our speakers answer questions and talk today, feel free to throw questions at them. We'll do our very best to answer everybody's questions. For those that we don't get to, we'll try to answer them offline after the webinar completes. So just to introduce our panel for today, we have Zoe Ferrari, the Pacific Head of Government for CBRE. Hey, Zoe. We have Ed Cotter, the Director of Strategic Sustainability at JLL. And from CIM, we have Howie Mann, who is the VP of Product. And CIM is, of course, our host for today's webinar. I'm going to hand things over to Howie now. He's going to give us a presentation around Australia's net zero and government operations strategy as it relates to the property sector and industry's progress. And then we're going to dive into some Q&A with our panelists. So with that, I'll hand things over to Howie.
Great, thanks, Anthony. I'll just share my screen here. Just get a thumbs up if you're seeing my screen. Awesome. All right, great. So I'll dig into it. Really excited, everyone, for coming on this webinar. Lots of changes coming through. I'll go through a high-level overview to some of the changes coming, but really keen to kind of get into some panelist discussions as well and open to Q&A with everyone. So Australia, I think as many of you know, is generally considered a world leader when it comes to energy efficiency and sustainability, particularly in building operations. And a lot of that is led by the government and their changes. And this is the biggest changes that have basically happened in the last 15 years, the government's new net zero and government operations strategy. So I'll go into what some of the changes are, why it matters, and some of the implications and what people can actually do about it. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So what's actually coming? As part of the Australian government's commitment to climate action, they've committed to reaching net zero in their own operations by 2030. There's a number of changes coming, but the biggest changes that are actually coming are across net zero buildings. The biggest driver of that is lifting the minimum leasing requirements from 4.5 stars in NABERS Energy to 5.5 stars coming soon, very, very soon, being enforced in July 2025. So why does that actually matter? Why is it important? Two major reasons. The first one is government is a major tenant, major leaser in the property market. They have over 3 million square meters of tenancy leased and spend over $1.5 billion annually on tenancy leases. And in general, also the federal government is considered a leader for what state governments do, as well as what corporates actually do and follow as well. And we've seen that in the past, and we're expecting that to continue in the future. And one of the biggest challenges now is that, unfortunately, this hurdle is very, very high. It's increasing quite significantly from 4.5 to 5.5. And currently, over 85% of government leases, the tenancies they're in right now, do not meet the minimum rating requirements. So there's going to be big changes that are actually going to be coming as a result of that. So this is just a quote from the Department of Finance. And I think what's great about this change is it's also being led by the Department of Finance as well, who's in control of a lot of the expenditure. And for them, this strategy represents really a commitment to lead by example. So the government is coming forward first and saying, rather than imposing and mandating what everyone else has to do, they're enforcing it across their own existing operations and expecting everybody else to follow as well. So let's dig into some of the key changes that are actually coming. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest changes is in the net zero in buildings. The current policy today is being superseded, will be superseded in 7 months' time with the new APS net zero policy. Current policy is the EEGO policy, Energy Efficiency in Government Operations. I think many people have been familiar with this. It's been in place for a while now. And basically, the main requirement is that a base building has to have a minimum energy rating of 4.5 out of 6 stars to basically qualify for a government tenant to come in. So the biggest changes that are coming through is the minimum leasing requirement floor space is decreasing. So more buildings are going to come under this scope from 2,000 square meters to 1,000 square meters. The biggest change is, of course, that big jump from 4.5 to 5.5. That's a very, very big jump and will require a huge increase in energy efficiency improvements to be able to meet that. That's cascading to tenancy requirements as well. Green lease schedules are still required, and there's also additional requirements that will come in force with the new net zero policy, including mandatory sub-metering for government tenants, EV charging if they have EV fleets, as well as for new builds, even higher rating requirements, 6-star NABERS Energy, 4-star Green Star for large builds. And whilst it's not mandatory at this stage as any minimum targets, they will also be considering other ratings as well, including NABERS water ratings, indoor environment ratings, and waste ratings as well. So big changes coming through. So I mentioned before, today, as it stands, government has released their latest figures. 85% of their leases in major cities do not meet that 5.5-star requirement. And there is a significant amount of leases that are coming up for lease expiring renewals in the next 5 years. So what's going to happen is we're expecting two things to happen. Either existing leases will have to up their game and meet that requirement and make investments in their buildings to achieve those energy efficiency improvements, or we're going to see a flight out of lower rated assets to higher rated sustainability focused assets. So this bifurcation of the market going from lower rated assets to higher rated assets. Now, when we look at the supply of the overall market, it also shows a stark picture that less than 28% of all office rated assets in the country currently meet that high 5.5 NABERS star rating. So there is definitely limited supply as it stands right now. But as is intended by the government in making these changes, is really pushing the industry to put sustainability at the forefront and start making investments to improve the energy efficiency operations for their buildings. So what does that mean for property owners? Well, property owners are going to be facing a dual challenge here of being able to maintain these high ratings whilst investing, basically making major investments in time for these lease renewals. So what does that actually mean if we look at the numbers? So what does 4.5 to 5.5, these are all numbers, these are all ratings, but what does that actually imply? Well, a building based on a previous rating requirement of 4.5 to reach a 5.5, that requires a 38% improvement in energy efficiency. So that's a very, very big saving requirement, close to 40% reduction in energy saving to achieve it. And obviously slightly lower for sites that are 5 stars that are beating that hurdle right now, but still requires a significant energy efficiency improvement of 25% coming through here. So achieving these hurdle rates for buildings, now a lot of buildings who are further down this path, obviously the saving requirement is going to be significantly larger, and it's going to require a combination of things to get right, basically energy optimization, upgrade, solar installation, as well as major projects. So it's a very ambitious target or policy that the government set, and we're expecting to see big changes come through in the market today. So we take a snapshot and look at, well, where can these changes actually be made? This is looking at across a typical commercial building, where the energy is actually being consumed and where we can basically find those optimization opportunities and upgrades. It's really across these major categories. So ventilation, chill water plant, heat rejection, central plant, HVAC represents the largest component of energy consumption in a building, as well as lights and elevators. So tackling these areas will help achieve that. So if we have a look at how we can basically go through and achieve those savings, really HVAC optimization strategies are the fastest to implement in a building that can have the fastest payback to get through. So typical building, depending if they have central plant or if they have optimization strategies already in place, can typically expect up to 20% energy efficiency improvements by basically making better use of the existing capital stock that already exists in buildings. But for a lot of sites, that's not going to be enough, depending on where they're currently rated. You're going to have to go through capital upgrade works as well, looking at upgrading equipment, looking at solar installation to be able to achieve that. In addition to the policy changes affecting net zero office and buildings, this also cascades to the hotel industry as well. So the government's also, as part of this policy, mandating that for government employees staying in hotel accommodation, they will basically be requiring them to stay in hotel accommodation that has NABERS Energy ratings done for those hotels. So NABERS Energy rating is currently not mandatory. It's only mandatory in office buildings in Australia. But this is a big incentive for the hotel industry to basically put sustainability at the forefront as well in order to attract government tenants, government employees to stay in their accommodation. So what we're expecting here is there isn't any minimum targets being set for the hotel industry, but we'll be expecting a large number of hotel owners to go through and start rating their assets in order to attract government tenants as well. So I might just pause there, Anthony, and pass that back to you to get back into the panel.
Awesome. Well, I think if you're in government and involved in leasing buildings, there's some pretty sobering numbers in there that are going to change the way building operations are managed, building leasing happens. Even I hadn't really thought about the impact on travel and accommodation, with government agencies now having to actually consider the NABERS ratings of hotels where they're going to stay when they travel. So it's a pretty broad sway that this is going to cut through government, and some fairly significant impacts. Let's dive into some questions with our panel. Zoe, why is the government actually doing this? Like, what's if it's this much effort and it's this hard, why?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the simple answer to that question is, to do their part for the overall climate change picture, right? It's when we look at the policy through a property lens, we know that property is the prime contributor to electricity and natural gas consumption and associated emissions. And then when you look at the Australian government's occupancy report study, it sort of starts to paint a pretty clear picture that the most feasible and cost-effective method to start to decrease these emissions is through enhanced energy efficiency and electrification of their property portfolio. So I think, it's obviously the right thing to do. We've seen a lot of the major corporate, privates and institutional ownership groups come on board with their own plans in this space. And I think it's really just bringing the whole thing into alignment to start to drive better outcomes.
So, Ed, is this a good thing? Do you think this is good for the property industry? Do you think a lot of property owners running around panicking at the moment? What's your view?
Depends on who you are. So I think it's a massive challenge. I think there's obviously a two-tiered approach. If you're an early adopter in this space, if you're one of those corporates or institutional investors, then absolutely, yes, they're well positioned. And moving forward, they're going to take advantage of this opportunity. They will definitely be targeting government tenants. But if you're not playing in that space in particular, if you're probably private equity or mum and dad landlord, then it's going to be a massive challenge. You're going to end up having a situation where the government tenant or department looks at your office space, for example, and they may say, all right, we may go or we may stay, depending on how you address some of our objectives and some of those requirements that Howie outlined earlier. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Those that take advantage of it and get on as early as possible will reap the benefits. Those that don't will pay the price.
So, Howie, is this only all about federal government agencies? Who else is going to be rolled into this? I know you've mentioned the hotel industry as one example, but how broad does this go?
So the new policies only affect federal government tenancies in terms of the mandate. But what we've seen in the past is federal government has typically been a first mover, and then the rest of the governments have followed. So when the EEGO was basically implemented, we saw the state governments then quickly follow thereafter and mandate minimum policies. In fact, the state governments at the time even lifted their requirements beyond what the EEGO actually required. So in New South Wales, whilst the federal government policy was 4.5 for many years now, the New South Wales state government's policy has been a minimum 5-star requirement, as well as mandating a minimum water efficiency rating as well. Mm-hmm. So we're expecting that to kind of cascade through. And even at CIM, what we're seeing with our major accounts is, more importantly, the corporate tenants are actually following as well. So the blue chip customers who are looking at getting premium real estate, they're requiring minimum energy efficiency standards in their green lease requirements, independent of what the government may actually want. So we definitely see this following.
And that's interesting, because when you think about private industry, we often think about private industry leading things along, but this is one of those aspects where government's pushing things up first and industries now having to catch up, because obviously particularly if they're in the property investment game, well, they've got space, they've got a building that the government's co-leasing with them. They want to make sure that they're up there as well. So there's some pretty significant impacts that are going to roll right through. And yet state governments, obviously a big factor. And we often forget that, NABERS started as a state government initiative before it rolled out and became a national thing.
That's right. Yeah.
So Howie, just while we've got you there, How would you assess the industry's current progress towards meeting these targets? I know you mentioned that there was some pretty big shortfalls and some gaps that have to be made, but what's their progress towards getting there? And what have you seen any notable trends around who's being compliant?
It's exactly as what Ed said. There's really this, as I mentioned before, this bifurcation in the market. We've seen the early adopters who've really made the investments upfront and have actually demonstrably shown they've already been achieving these targets. And the rest of the market, in terms of smaller assets, smaller property owners, private equity groups, they haven't made the investments upfront. They've been very much focused on buying and flipping assets rather than long-term investments, and they'll fall short. So we have the numbers actually here, and across the large premium asset owners, so the big national players, whilst I gave you that number, that 88% of the market wasn't actually achieving it, across the larger players, 40% of their rated office asset area is actually currently compliant. That's twice as much as the rest of the market. So what we're going to be seeing almost definitely is that when I say there's this flight to premium assets with government tenancies, the question is, where are they flying to? And they're really going to be flying to the larger blue chip REITs and moving away from these smaller owners. And a lot of the strategies we're seeing across the larger property owners have been very much centered on investing in premium assets with high sustainability credentials, and in order to attract those higher rental premiums as well. So what's good that I see in the market now is that that sustainability is no longer seen as a tax or a greenwashing thing that you actually have to put in. It's actually good for business now. You can actually attract better tenants.
And I guess, when the government starts to lift its standards, it's a bit of the rising tide lifts all boats and everyone comes along for the ride. So Ed, there's a few other things that go into this. I know Howie's mentioned HVAC in particular as one of the main energy, or one of the main areas where energy efficiency can be built. But what about other things like electrification, EV charging, metering, and green lease schedules? How's the industry tracking there?
I think we have to go back to that two-tiered or two-speed approach to the way that they're addressing many of these particular issues to get to zero carbon within the built form. As we were saying before, most definitely those institutional investors and those corporates, they see the benefit and they're moving down that path. We had a client quite recently that actually negotiated a break clause in the lease if the building that they were going to move into wasn't electrified within a certain date or period. So from that perspective, yes, there's definitely a shift in that direction. But beyond that, again, we still have that sort of, lower grade building, mid-tier buildings that really aren't moving at all. So they've got a lot of work to do. Green leasing plays a part, state government plays a part, federal government, obviously, with this strategy and this approach with those targets is most definitely playing a leadership role. It's interesting to see that in Victoria, they've gone down that path of zero gas and going down an electrification path for all new builds, which is fantastic. But that still leaves the issue around what do we do with the existing built form. And while there is leadership from government and from those that get their funds from institutions and corporates, we do need to look at that from and this is something I guess Zoe might be able to build upon, how do we actually start to tap into these initiatives and these opportunities for those that fall outside of that corporate or institutional government sort of approach?
Yeah, so with that, Zoe, in your engagement with government tenants, what's the response been? Do they see these as a good thing, as a bad thing? Are they panicking? What's kind of going on?
It's funny, right? Because listening to some of the conversation, and particularly how we just touched on it before around the, I guess, the mixed bag of responses or reaction from a landlord side, it's kind of the same within government. You've got, some government entities that are already well advanced in this space, and they're already doing a lot of things internally that are very in line with the policy outcomes. So those conversations are obviously very different to entities that might have very limited internal capability in the sustainability space. And this policy is kind of very new to them and quite scary in terms of what the outputs are looking like and what the commitments are needing to be made from them. So generally, everybody's on board in terms of wanting to do the right thing. I think that's the first thing that I will say. I don't think we've had any negative conversations with any government entities who have said this is a joke and we're 100% not aligned. I think everyone is just at a very different state of maturity in terms of their understanding of how to adopt the policy, how to work with their landlords to drive the best outcomes out of the policy, and how to do it in a cost-effective way, right? Like it's going to add cost to a lot of the entities and the departments to introduce some of these measures. So a lot of sort of guidance, hand-holding. They're getting really good support from government, from the discussions we're having. There's a lot of forums that have been set up for entities to be able to tap into and share thought leadership pieces on some of the stuff that the more progressive entities are doing. But yeah, generally I would say that it's been well received, but depending on which entity, there's a bit of nervousness out there for sure.
So, I mean, for Ed and Zoe, for both of you, really, what's this going to mean for rental premiums? This is a question we've just had from the audience. I mean, when assets start to go to 5.5 stars, what's going to happen? Are rents going to become dearer? Do we just expect the building owners to kind of wear it and maintain their costs maintain their premiums at where they are? What's your expectation? Maybe Ed first and then Zoe.
I think the bigger issue at play, and it's really hard to put an uplift value on rental premiums for like a 5-star or 6-star Green Star or NABERS rated building. I think the bigger question at play is what happens in terms of those that don't address this, that don't go down this path. So obviously the mandatory disclosure reporting requirements that came out, that there was a consultation paper that came out quite recently, sets out a roadmap that goes down that path in terms of what the performance upgrade requirements might be. Those that don't comply, they'll be facing some sort of brand discount because they won't be able to find a tenant to occupy their building. And that's probably a bigger question, right? What will that look like? What sort of impact will that have? From a government perspective, they're going to be able to find the appropriate office space to meet their requirements under this objective, then they'll move early. But then what does that leave for the rest of the industry? Where do they go? What do they look for? And what's the cost of doing those upgrades as well? That for me is a bigger question.
Yeah, I think it without a doubt to meet the requirements within the policy, it's going to cost. It's not cheap, and I think landlords are still coming to terms with what those roadmaps look like and what the associated costs might be to electrify your asset or to bring your NABERS rating up to speed. I think what's interesting is when you overlay that consideration with the Commonwealth of Australia's key value for money outcome drivers with their lease negotiations. So it's very obvious that when you start to look at the policy requirements and then you start to look at the types of assets that are going to be able to support those requirements, they're going to be expensive, right? They're not your C and D grade buildings or your B grade assets. They're your new builds, your brand new shiny boxes. And therefore they're going to attract the premium end of the market in terms of rental, which we all know that is not historically where the Commonwealth is comfortable sitting from a value for money perspective. So I think that is a really interesting piece to unpack around how that's going to come into alignment when you've got a federal government that's still very much cost efficiency driven in terms of their leasing decisions. And you've got assets now that we're talking are going to be pitched at the premium end of the market and attract the higher rents. I think there is a big disconnect there, Anthony.
Yeah, and I would imagine, based on the data that Howie presented earlier, there's probably a scarcity of 5.5 star buildings, and scarcity is one of the big drivers of price.
I'd say it also presents an opportunity for those that are willing to have a look at their poorly performing assets. I'd position them in two categories: those that are looking at a value add or a retrofit opportunity, and then those that really need to be repurposed or repositioned. The repositioning one is a really interesting piece, and the business case most definitely has to be built around, okay, what will the outcomes be associated with that investment, and what will that return? Are they trying to target a better type of client over a longer term with better tenure? What's the payback period for that sort of return on that investment? But there are incentives and support and mechanisms and finance mechanisms out there. I know that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation has over $30 billion that they're willing to well, put into net zero carbon initiatives, including work within the built form. But then there are other, I guess, sustainability linked or property linked style finance mechanisms out there that can be tapped into. I know CPACE in the United States has been hugely successful. Maybe not so much here. It's also known as environmental upgrade finance, for want of a better term. Most likely going to be called property linked finance moving forward, but that was really successful in helping to unlock the equity in the property and enable some of the landlords to do those upgrades and achieve some of the net zero carbon targets.
I might just add to that. Sorry, Anthony, just on what Ed said. Those 2 points. I think a lot of people totally agree on the tenure point as well on the financing point. I think a lot of people think about rental premiums just about how much dollar per square meter I can actually get, but forget to think about actual tenure and how important WALE is, right? Having a long lease, having that security, whether it's from a government tenant or a corporate tenant, and being able to have those high energy ratings. I mean, they're obviously I get out of jail free cards with the new net zero policy. I mean, only applies for 4+ year leases. So you can obviously assume a lot of people will be negotiating potentially lower lease terms. Then that also introduces more risk for property owners. So securing a longer lease tenant because you have high sustainability credentials is definitely a strong positive factor, and no one wants to be getting into a building knowing there's all these regulatory changes coming into place. But as Ed mentioned as well, there's so much support coming from the private sector as well as the government sector in terms of cheaper access to capital and financing to basically incentivize this. So at the top line, we're basically protecting on the WALE, and on the bottom line, we're actually protecting against the cost of financing. And we're seeing, particularly with the tier 1 corporates, the early adopters, they've had the advantage of tying their sustainability credentials to their cost of financing as well.
We've got another question from the audience. I always love questions from the audience because I know you guys don't know what they're going to be. So it's a bit of potluck for you guys, keeps it interesting. But this is one that's probably directed to each of you. So maybe we'll take it in turns unless people feel like everything's already been said, but I'll give Zoe the first crack at this question. In your experience, what percentage of leases now contain green components?
Are we talking government?
Yeah, we'll stick to government for the moment.
Yeah, well, most should really right now with the introduction of the green lease schedule. So if you have federal government within your asset and they've been in there for circa the last 10 years, they should be on some kind of green lease schedule requirement that sits within the CNL that governs that lease. So that will be that document will continue to mature and grow and expand as it has done since its introduction. But a lot of this stuff shouldn't be new for owners who are familiar with federal government occupants within their assets.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, green leasing's been around for decades.
Like 2000 and I was trying to remember the date it was first brought.
First one, the standard that Howie pointed out before was 2006, I think, from memory.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be anything new. And for those corporates and government departments, I mean, there should be, as Zoe was saying, there should be a clause in there around, for example, data sharing or performance requirements or whatnot. So it's nothing new. I think there is a shift though, which is really interesting. I think the percentage outside of that top tier is going to be very, very low, if at all, to tell the truth, maybe even zero. But for those that are looking at those premium assets, I think most are starting to think about this and have already incorporated it.
Did you have anything to add to that, Howie?
No, it was all said.
Right.
Great.
Thanks, guys. That's great. Like, as I said, I love an audience question. Keeps us all on our toes. And we do have another one sitting there in the thing, so I'll let it stew for a while so you can all panic while you're waiting for it. Let's move on a little bit. We're going to talk a bit about some practical advice around energy. And as we're moving to these new leasing standards that are going to come out in the middle of next year, property owners and operators are already faced with different paths depending on where they currently stand with their NABERS energy rating profile. Some of them are going to be below, some of them are going to be well below, and some are actually already there or above. So Zoe, for the ones that are just below, so if they're looking at 5.5, maybe these are the guys that are sitting on 5 or thereabouts. For the ones that are just below the target, what are some of the strategic steps you'd recommend to help those landlords close that gap?
Yeah, I mean, from an asset operational standpoint, I'll let Ed and Howie kind of tackle those questions. But certainly, I think one of the probably most valuable pieces of advice I can offer is engage with your tenants as a landlord, you know, talk to your tenants around the shared responsibility in this space and how you can create partnership outcomes to drive and close that gap. Because as we know, there's only so much from a base building perspective you can sort of contribute in terms of the operational outcomes of the assets. And a lot of it will be, and particularly in government, right, where you normally have government tenants that are either single tenanted assets, or there's one or two major departments within the building because of the sheer size and volume of the department. So I think that the piece that I often see in conversations I have with both Commonwealth entities and landlords is just that missing link of a shared partnership approach. Engage with each other, talk to each other. You're both on this journey together. You're both trying to drive better and more sustainable outcomes in the way the buildings are operated, used. I think that for me is certainly emerging as something that has been a missed opportunity and presents a massive opportunity moving forward.
So, Ed, for you, for the ones that are well below, so the ones that are sort of sitting on that 4.5, you know, for those buildings that are well below the target of 5.5, they're going to need a lot of significant improvement. What guidance can you offer them? How should they approach capital upgrades, for example, to ensure long-term compliance and sustainability?
I think Howie's graph that demonstrated optimization and then the mechanical upgrades and then other, you know, broader capital investment is an excellent graph that demonstrates at what stage you should be going through this process. We mentioned before the two there that I see sitting in this sort of bracket that are well below, those that require broader retrofits and those that potentially need to be repurposed. It comes just down to building a decent business case at the end of the day, looking for what incentives are already out there, tapping into those incentives, making sure you understand who your target market is and also what the demand is. We know that the demand for premium office space that has those NABERS ratings, those high Green Star and NABERS ratings, well outstrips the actual supply, especially in places like Sydney and Melbourne. So it is really around, you know, presenting that business case and building that accordingly so that you can justify the investment over a period of time.
And Howie, for the ones that are above, they're kind of sitting on that 5.5 or even maybe, you know, already reaching out towards 6. What are some of the best practices for them to maintain and protect that rating?
Yeah, so the big one is I think people don't appreciate how much energy is used by the equipment in the building. I think people have this misconception that energy use is the lights that are being turned on or off, and you can't really do anything about it. They fail to understand that behind the scenes there's all this engineering, machinery, equipment that's basically making sure everyone can breathe inside that building. And so what we often see is that even if a building's maintained the full rating, all it takes is for a major piece of plant to trip or a thing to short circuit, and for that thing to basically continue running, piece of equipment continue running for a few weeks, that can completely blow out your ratings. And that happens all the time. So being able to have monitoring in place to ensure that, really following your grandma's rule, right? Like turn things off when you leave the room, make sure you don't leave things running, is easy to do in your own home, but doing that in a large facility is quite challenging. So the recommendation is to plug CIM, or is definitely to look at real-time monitoring capabilities that you have to ensure that you're monitoring your equipment, that it's not running as hard as it needs to. But beyond that, for, I would say, sites that don't have the investment in that capabilities, it is engaging and doing regular performance audits and doing the level 1 audits, checking that set points are aligned. These things are all they don't cost a lot to implement. It's just basically having the discipline to not take it for granted.
Ed, a question from the audience for you. Do we have enough tech in Australia to achieve the upgrade of HVAC and electrification in the timeframes we're talking about? Do you think we're actually able to do this? Do we have the capability?
Short answer, yes. Absolutely. We have more than enough capability to be doing this work and making these upgrades. It's proven tech out there. Everything from HVAC through lighting, through to, you know, hot water services, et cetera, et cetera. The technology and the equipment is already out there. It's the implementation, it's the timing, it's the business case. That's the thing that's taking time. If we have the right regulatory levers and incentives in place, then absolutely we can do this.
That's good. An audience question for you, Zoe. Is there any indication about what might be expected from a landlord that's in a failing rating situation? So they've potentially already got a government tenant in there. They're struggling to hit that 5.5. Do you know what's going to happen for them? Are they going to need a remediation plan? Is there going to be a timeline, Sam? Are they going to suffer a financial penalty of some sort? What's the expectation there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was just talking about this with someone the other day, actually, because when they first brought in the 4.5-star NABERS mandated rating, it only applied to new leases being signed. Obviously, it would have been a complete basket case if every existing lease then fell into, having to conform with that requirement. And correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone else has read it, I haven't read anything in the policy that speaks specifically to it adopting a similar process, but I assume if you've got a federal government tenant within your asset on an existing lease, that existing lease will remain in place, and it's the new leases and at the point of negotiation or renewal that penalty or that requirement to upgrade will come into play. So as a landlord, you really need to be looking at those critical dates within your leases and starting to understand what your obligations are going to be at that point in time. If you've just signed a brand new 15-year lease, you've got a lot of time, obviously, to start to consider your obligations. But it will only come into play, as far as I'm aware, once those critical dates hit and you're up for those renewal or new lease conversations.
That's probably a good nuance there, because it's not like on the 1st of July next year.
Exactly.
The world changes for everybody instantaneously. There's a bit of grandfathering that goes on with existing leases.
Yeah, and I think look, it's human behavior, right? We all sort of panic when we see these sorts of policies hit the market, and we all tend to sort of deep dive into them and look at the worst case scenario. But when you take the time to consider the policy, I think the government has been pretty reasonable in terms of the timeframes and the way in which they're approaching it. We're having discussions at the moment with a number of different entities who are in lease negotiations, and they will start to have to consider the implications of these requirements. And it's around, giving a reasonable commitment from a landlord to your roadmap to electrify by 2040, right? You need to start to present. And I think where it's a little bit grey, in my view, is from a landlord perspective, how some of those dates will be considered from evaluation. So if you're not electrified, does that start to look at the valuation? We'll consider that as a get out of jail free card, and you have ongoing implications then to consider from that perspective. But I think there has been reasonable time allowed for landlords to kind of adjust, and our conversations with entities have been very reasonable, right? That they're sort of saying, we want to work with the landlords, we want to understand what their CapEx commitments are, and we want reasonable commitments within the lease that drive these better outcomes.
Yeah, I think I'll just add that that's correct. Sorry, that's how we read and interpreted it, and applies to new leases. But just to throw some more FUD in there for people to think about, I think one thing people don't appreciate is that, particularly with the NABERS rating, it's based on a NABERS Energy rating, which is on actual operating performance of your previous 12 months. So it's not a spot rating that you do. It's not based on best endeavors, intentions, or what you're planning to do. You have to demonstrate, as you've done the rating, what are your actual energy performance of the preceding 12 months. So what that actually means is, if you've got a lease coming up in 2 years' time, you need to start implementing everything today so that you can see the benefits in 12 months for you to actually hit that. So I think that really, a lot of people fail to understand that it's 12 months of actual performance data dictates what your result is.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to that strategy piece of really considering those critical dates and what your obligations are going to be, and putting a rock solid map in place that's going to allow you to meet them.
I think
your drop dead date is not the date of the new lease. It's a year before that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you know when your dates are, and you plan for that date, so you know that your data is going to be clean by that point.
Yeah. And we've got portfolio owners that are looking at both. They're considering the performance of their portfolio. They're doing for want of a better term, a net zero carbon pathways assessment on their whole portfolio, and then prioritizing what needs to be done, then reviewing their lease schedules and saying, okay, what's coming up for renewal? What should I focus on? What do I need to do in terms of performance upgrades or or broader repositioning, and how can I keep my tenants or get a better tenant in for that matter.
You kind of talked a little bit there about you know, the need for that data to be there for 12 months, and also a bit of negotiation and transparency between tenants and landlords and so on. One of the audience questions we've just got through is, what reporting do government tenants ask from landlords regarding asset efficiency performance, and how does the tenant engage with that reporting? I think that's probably an Ed or a Zoe question.
I was going to throw that one to Ed.
I was going to throw it to Howie.
Oh.
I'm happy to jump in.
Well, I'll jump on the Howie bandwagon then.
So I'll jump in. So there's the standard reporting requirements would be your NABERS Energy, your NABERS credentials, which is publicly available on the rating register, and any time you go in a building you actually see. So it's visible there. But in addition, on a lot of green lease schedules, what they're requiring as part of it is that reporting and constant communication of how energy is being used in a building. So usually that takes the form, depending on how the green lease schedule is actually written. And I'll let Ed talk to that. But what we've seen is like quarterly meetings with committee members between the facilities team and the tenant facilities team, where there's information sharing, and sometimes it's both ways. So the tenant will actually share them a report on energy usage in the building. So looking at monthly usage in terms of how it's actually trended. And if they're sub-metering, the tenant will also share information on energy they're using as well. So let's not forget, as part of these requirements, there's 2 ratings that have to be achieved. There's a 5.5 on the base bill, but also 5.5 on the tenancy side. So a lot of governments can't forget that if they're a tenant in this building, it's not enough to have the property owner achieve great efficiency if they're there as a government tenant, Bitcoin mining every single day using their computers and servers and damaging their rating. Obviously, the government's not doing that.
Not our government anyway.
Not our government. But they have to ensure that there's a level of efficiency there. So they're not leaving, mostly it's to do with servers, not leaving televisions on, they're not leaving dishwashers on. Usually it's computers and servers, and the tenancies are the largest consumers of energy. So there's information sharing between the two.
One of the biggest barriers to that, though, is actually getting access to a counterpart's data, which is a huge issue, whether that be through the BMS or whether that be via NMIs or whatnot. So it's really important in that point to actually have a clear data sharing clause within that lease arrangement.
Yeah, and I think, that's the highlight. I mean, obviously the building owner has got some responsibility for how much energy is used in the building, but the tenants also contribute to that through their own activities also. Just another question for you, Howie, that's come through from the audience. A 38% improvement from NABERS 5.0 to 5.5 seems pretty aggressive, particularly with new buildings with new technology and solar installations, geothermals and so on. Is it practical to go from 5 to 5.5 if you've already got a whole bunch of stuff in place?
So just to qualify, that 38% increase is from 4.5 to 5.5.
Okay.
So from 5 to 5.5, it's a 25% increase. The question is it practical? The short answer is it depends. Depends on what's actually been implemented in that building. So if you have a building that has a lot of central plant and a lot of control in the building, optimization is a perfect use case for you to extract energy efficiencies in that building. So that's quite achievable. But if you have a building that is just completely controlled by tenants and doesn't have the right infrastructure, it may not be possible to be able to achieve without doing a complete retrofit of the building and installing more fine-grained control across the assets. So I'm surprised the government came out with this. I was expecting they would come out from 4.5 to 5, but complete kudos to them for going much higher and setting that target. I'm an economist by training, by background, and one of the things that we absolutely kind of obsess about in economics is the principal agent problem, right? And that's the definitive problem here in climate change and environment, is that it's like, well, whose problem is it? Who's going to affect that change? So setting one goal isn't one thing, but then you think about all the stakeholders involved to actually affect that change. Tenants are involved, facilities teams are involved. Someone's paying for the bill, someone's not paying for the bill. So the government coming out here, setting a standard that everyone can measure every year. We have to hit this target. And I see the impact that has across the entire stakeholder industry. Everyone obsesses about how can I get that rating? And it's such a great thing for the government to put out there, because now people have to think of creative ways of how can I actually achieve that.
So let's move around just to our last little block of questions, and we do have a couple more from the audience sitting in the list. So I'll come back to those a little bit later. So if you've asked us a question, we'll come back to it in a few moments if we have the time before our allotted time ends. But Ed, given your team's work on the Green Leasing Resource Pack for Better Buildings Partnership, what are the essential elements that owners should consider when developing a green lease schedule? And another 2025 requirement for government initiatives or government tenancies. Sorry.
I think Zoe touched on it earlier around partnership, and it is in the BBP title itself. Partnership and collaboration is absolutely critical and key to the whole process. Identifying common objectives, sustainability, net zero carbon, et cetera, and ensuring that you're both working towards those goals is a fundamental principle to ensuring that you get a good outcome through any lease negotiation. With that in mind, I think there's three key elements that you really, really need to focus on. I mean, green leasing's been around for decades, but the approach has been obviously refined over a period of time. I think the first thing is start as early as possible. Have those conversations, be really clear on what you're trying to achieve and what those common objectives are. The next one is, and Howie just touched on it, the fact that running and operating a building is a multifaceted stakeholder engagement program. Right? Having the right people in the room for that conversation so that you know what needs to be addressed and when it needs to be addressed is essential to incorporating that into any lease requirements. I've heard of stories where certain lease clauses have been put in a lease agreement and then the asset manager, for whatever reason, won't enforce those specifics. And the final one is being really, really clear, having a look at what those options are, making sure that those objectives meet those requirements, and then incorporating that into like a heads of agreement before you go down the path of finalizing any lease itself. So our approach is a three-step approach. It's pretty much very similar to many approaches that have been used. And that was a key component of the BBP development in terms of the resource pack. It was very much around an industry-wide approach to collaboration and developing that pack. So for those that aren't aware of it, go and have a look at it. It's got some really good practical tips and guidance. It's freely available to download. So a bit of a plug to the team there. But yeah, so that would be my suggestion. Go and check out the BBP resource pack.
So just to remind everyone what BPP is, it's the Green Leasing Resource Pack for the Better Buildings Partnership.
Thanks, Anthony.
Got to remember the jargon.
Yeah, totally.
Zoe, with government moving towards to prioritise all electric buildings for leases starting next year, what are some of the key challenges and opportunities for property managers that they're going to face in making this transition? What advice do you give them to future-proof their buildings to meet the 2040 all-electric mandate?
It's a big question. So I think we've probably covered a lot of the challenges, right, that we're facing. I think and Ed's talked quite a lot in detail around the risks to those assets that will really struggle to be electrified, and that could be as simple as plant room capacity to house the updated equipment. Getting a roadmap done early, I think, is critical. So, review your assets, get the expertise in to provide a roadmap of what it would look like to electrify your asset, because asset life cycle planning is critical. You want to be making sure that you take those opportunities when your plant and equipment is coming up for replacement or major repairs, that you are looking at that through a lens of, hey, we want to get to this electrification end game. And I think, keeping tabs on the opportunities to integrate your works as these years tick by. So we all know in the property industry that integrating works is often the most cost-effective way to drive the best value for money outcome. So if you've got major upgrades planned, if you've got refurbishment upgrades planned, having that roadmap done early and getting the expertise involved in your asset planning from an early phase will really allow you to inform those decisions over the coming years to make better decisions at the right time. That's ultimately going to save you, I think, in the long run. And then I can't sort of stress enough around that partnership approach, right? Talk to your tenants, engage with your tenants, let them know where you're at. Because one thing we have found through a lot of the discussions that Commonwealth entities are underestimating is the disruption of an electrification conversion. So it's quite comprehensive, as we would all know, and it includes a lot of on-floor works, it includes a lot of ceiling works. So you need to engage with your tenants around what that looks like and how it's going to be rolled out, and what the best times are to start to look at integrating that work. If the tenant's got a refit plan, to use that opportunity to start to look at your plans as a landlord. But yeah, it's a hard one because everyone's different. I think we've sort of talked about every asset's going to be slightly different, every landlord's slightly different, every tenant's slightly different. So it's really a case-by-case basis.
We've got an audience question, but I think some of it's going to be taken by what I'm about to ask Howie. But what advice do you have, Howie, around addressing some of the other ratings that are considered in government site selection? Things like indoor environment, water, waste. The question that we got from the audience was around the NABERS indoor environment getting a mention in the APS strategy. So maybe do you want to talk a bit maybe around some of those other ratings and what they mean?
Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, it makes sense for property owners to go through and basically baseline measure and just get those ratings in there. I think there's this fear of not getting the rating because it might be a bad rating and not wanting to disclose it, but that's the only way you can basically improve. So whilst the APS policy doesn't have strict water requirements, that's already in place for state governments in New South Wales and I believe in South Australia as well, where there is a minimum water efficiency requirement. And I say why that's important is because I think people don't understand the interplay between all these factors. Indoor air quality, water, and energy are all basically byproducts of how your operating equipment is working in your building. So if you go through a big project and try and optimize your operating equipment inside your central plant, you may inadvertently cause a consequence of using 3 times as much water in your cooling towers, which is your largest consumer of water in your building, and demolishing your ratings. And the last thing you want to do is then all of a sudden come back and be like, great, I've hit my energy target, but I've completely blown out on my water efficiency as well. So having those ratings forces you, almost incentivizes you to keep an eye on that. Indoor air quality has been a big push in terms of indoor environment ratings that we've seen across a lot of the larger property owners in terms of rolling that out. And there's really been 2 influencing factors for that. One is post-COVID. Right, post-COVID, we've seen a big focus on indoor air quality and protecting well-being and safety of people in the indoor environment. Globally, we've also seen WELL ratings as another global certification has just exploded in popularity, not just across building owners, but also with regards to corporate companies as well. And the great thing about all the rating systems in the world now is that they all help contribute to each other. So if you get a NABERS indoor environment rating, that helps contribute to your WELL rating. So whilst it's not mandatory at this stage, as we said, the APS policy is considering that as a factor. So you have to basically come down to, okay, I've got 2 assets, they're basically the same. They're both 5.5. What am I going to choose? Well, of course, I'm going to choose the other one that's also got water efficiency and indoor air quality safety as well in that asset. So my advice is get rated. These things don't cost a lot. Find out if you're doing a bad job and then fix it.
Thanks, Howie. Now, we just have one last question from our audience, and anyone can throw to this one if they like. But we've been talking a lot about the government and the buildings that they use. Do we expect other things like retail shopping centres and other property classes to eventually come into this regime with the expectation of higher NABERS ratings?
That answer is yes. I think the roadmap consultation paper that they put out quite recently, the federal government gives a clear indication on at what stage different building classes are going to come online. I know that to start with, though, we'll be dropping the office space requirement down to 500 square metres to get that rating. And then beyond that, they'll stage it over a period of time out to 2030. So retail shopping centres, hotels, broader assessments on industrial as well will all come into play over the next 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, I might just add to that, to what Ed said. We're also seeing this big pressure come from industry super funds. So industry super funds are huge investors in property, particularly across the retail asset class. And they're independent of the government, already have their responsible investment mandates of minimum sustainability requirements that they require. So for shopping centres who are looking at attracting external investment, it basically is table stakes now to ensure that you have energy and minimum water efficiency standards.
And that sort of ties back into the new TCFD requirements for mandatory climate disclosures as well. So many of those larger institutions and corporates need to report against that, and that's going to come into effect from the 1st of Jan next year. So that will start to drive many of these upgrade requirements and performance ratings as well.
Well, thanks, everybody. We've come to the end of our allotted time. So I want to thank our 3 panelists, Ed, Zoe, and Howie, for their time today. They've done a sterling job of answering the questions that they weren't expecting, as well as the ones they were expecting. So thank you guys for your contributions today. For those of you that are listening in today live, when the webinar ends, you'll get access to a short survey that we'd really appreciate that you complete. The feedback that you guys provide us helps us with working out what we're going to do next with webinars, how we can make them better, and to make sure that we present the topics and subjects that are most important to you. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.